Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. We're absolutely delighted to have Dr. Eerika Hedman-Phillips join us today. Now, Eerika is talent management lead for an international sports media and broadcasting company. And in a long, illustrious history, which stands back 15 years, she's also been group talent capability, inclusion and research lead for Belron. Belron is an enormous company operating in 37 countries across 6 continents and home to around 29,000 employees who serve 15 million customers. So it's a real example of scale. So Eerika is a fascinating guest, and we're absolutely delighted that she's agreed to be on our podcast today. So just a little bit of background about her. So she's an experienced OD and leadership development professional with years of experience in leadership development, coaching, change, and research. And she's got a deep core expertise that lies in human relations, interaction, and really fostering inclusive ways of leading and collaborating. She's really passionate about creating a fulfilling employee experience and helping people thrive. And you'll also notice, obviously, she's a doctor by profession. She's pragmatic with an academic background and applies systemic thinking in her approach. Now, I actually met Eerika when I was doing my master's dissertation on a particular, and I was applying a particular theory called CMM, the coordinated management of meaning. And this is something that Eerika's really specialized in as well, and has actually taken on leadership roles within the CMM Institute as well. She has a PhD degree in leadership and organization development, and it was on a fascinating subject. And she's research is focused on things like leadership development at the executive level, improving working relationships and teamwork, particularly on senior leadership. And she's a published author and has contributed chapters to co-creating cosmopolitan organizations, which is a really important thing for global organizations as well. So thank you so much for joining us, Eerika. We're absolutely delighted to have you join us.
What an introduction. Very pleased to be here.
It's brilliant to have you here. So Eerika, it'd be great if you could just tell us a bit about your role. What does it involve? What do you get up to?
So if I talk broadly more in talent management, so what you would normally expect to see in that space. So really kind of you're building the capability in the business for future. So you would probably see kind of your typical competencies, behavioral frameworks, kind of developing them, assessing talent, reviewing kind of your typical kind of performance potential, those kind of things, as well as then leading kind of how we listen our organizations. So developing that employee experience, kind of a full spectrum and journey on that and that space, and obviously D&I forming part of that. I think that's probably covering most aspects of my work, but they're always little things here and there that will pop up and I get involved in.
And it's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Because I guess one of the things that organizations often overlook is that they develop the strategy, but they don't necessarily understand or consider the capabilities that are required, not only what they need to have, but where they are now. Is that part of your key role, sort of helping identifying those capabilities?
Yeah, so we've done a big exercise of identifying kind of what's needed now and what's needed in the future. So and I guess that is a continuous conversation that just needs to be aligned in businesses. So kind of that we don't find ourselves that, oh, there's a new technology coming and we have no one in the business who can do that. So it's just kind of trying to be a bit ahead of the game, but I don't necessarily know the answers. So it's more of how do we facilitate those conversations and being constantly kind of checking and seeing kind of how to anticipate, but also what we do from a learning and development perspective, for example, is then also responding to some of the needs to develop those skills.
And how far out are you looking when you're looking at kind of long future needs?
Oh, I don't know how far you can look at these days. Things change so quickly. It is probably kind of immediate and then short term, kind of 2 to 3 years maybe. Is really hard to predict anything beyond that, I find.
Yeah, I think you're right. The world's changing so quickly, isn't it? It's like, how do we know what the world's going to look like?
Exactly.
So how do you go about doing your work? Like, how do you go about being sort of the talent management lead? What does that actually entail?
Navigating lots of messy and complex things, as I'm sure you know. So I think it's kind of different approaches. So, and I find having also spent kind of a good 10 years as an external consultant coming in, I find the kind of external internal dynamic is a bit different because you are fully in the system and swimming in the culture and the patterns and the dynamics and all of that. So there is a bit of that sort of planning, project management, that kind of hat, but then using some of the OD and consultative mindset and skills alongside, and sometimes it is coaching. So I think it's a various different ways, or kind of, yeah, different approaches that work.
Obviously, your work is sort of underpinned by certain ways. One of the things we talked about was CMM, coordinating management of meaning, which I think I've got a book on my shelf here, which I think nearly broke me. It's
Yeah.
the
Oh, brilliant.
Barnett Pierce. Day one of my masters, I got a copy of this, and I was like, what have I got myself into? And it's an amazingly elegant theory, but it really shapes the way in which you see the world. What could you just give us a bit of a brief description in terms of, sort of how it is and how it works for lay people that might be sort of seeing it for the first
Oh
time?
gosh, there's so much to unpack, and I think obviously as a OD consultant or kind of being internal, I think is always too dangerous to get involved and too lost in a theory or a practice. But I think the benefit of CMM, or coordinated management of meaning, is that it doesn't really fix you into gives you the tools to kind of see and perceive the world and then do something about it. So in a way, I see it as a very practical, broad kind of theory. So just to give a bit of background, so it's classed as a interpersonal communication theory, probably kind of the beginnings in the late 70s, early 80s. And as a response to the more traditional communication model, so what you may kind of recall as a transmission model of communication. So kind of the assumption that if someone is speaking very clearly and someone listening very attentively, we get a perfectly clear communication without any misunderstandings and so forth. And we know that's not really true. So it was kind of leaning into the messiness and complexity of what actually happens between people when we come together. We try to make sense of what's happening around us. We bring a lot of our personal sort of different contexts, our understanding of the relationships, our identity, and all of that into the mix of things. And then we try to navigate it together with other people and somehow end up in some form of clarity or kind of cohesive relationship. So that's really kind of the basis of the theory, and helping you to explain kind of what happens in that situation, but then also asking the questions like, what is it that we're actually doing together that makes this thing that is this or what happens here? So one of the key, I would say the key principles is a thing called reflexivity, which I also kind of tapped on in my own research. Is like, how do we create those reflexive patterns of communication, which means that I'm responsible for the social realities that I'm part of creating. So oftentimes in organizations, when you get into topics like culture and things like that, it's easy sort of to be in a place of helplessness and being victim of it. So like, I'm doing this because the culture is like that, or the culture is like this, or the team is like that, or the boss is like that. Therefore, I'm behaving in this way. And part of that is because our behavior is situated in a system and it's kind of born in the system. But at the same time, we're part of creating the pattern. So we are actually responding to something that we've been part creating. And I think that's the kind of the reflexive sort of relationship in our communication, that it's looking into that and understanding that kind of relationship, that how am I bringing what I'm bringing into this relationship, which I'm also responding.
Honestly, that's one of the best definitions of coordinated management of meaning I've ever heard. And for a Friday afternoon when we're recording this, is even more impressive as well. I guess one of the things that we really like about it is the fact that it gives people a sense of agency. So even when you're feeling power under, and you're floating along with the tide of the culture, you still have responsibility for how you respond to things. And
Exactly.
when people invite you into being either passive or other kinds of invitations, you actually have much more choice and understanding the implications as well.
Yeah. And I think it's broadening the perspective of, I'm not limited by the various story that there's multiple stories I'm telling about the situation, whether it's from a perspective of what do I think about myself? Do I come from a context of, I'm a professional, or I'm a family member, or whatever that is that I bring into. And then there's the other context of how I'm perceiving and making sense of the relationship and the conversation that is happening in front of me. And then there's the kind of the common situation, the context that might be somehow shared, but most often not. So I think it's just understanding that people come with multiple stories into a situation, and some of those stories may play more of a critical part in the way they respond to things. This kind of enriching our kind of understanding, I suppose, from conversations, human relationships, and then how we might change the story that we tell about that in order to change our own experience.
It's really interesting because obviously a lot of the audience here are people that are aspiring to go into organization development or design, and there's often the bit about self as instrument, isn't it? Is understanding how you show up and that as well. And obviously this is not about me sort of showing up, but for me this was the tool that helped me understand self as instrument, and the discombobulation that we all have to go through as OD consultants. This was the thing that did me.
Wow, yeah.
Because it really does get you to look at the stories you tell yourself and things.
Yeah.
And particularly when you are in a system creating change, you always try to unpack what's the system stuff and what's my stuff as well. And this gives you a really precise lens to look at things, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I guess kind of when I was more of an external consultant, it was going like, what's the frame of reference I'm going into the situation? So how the way I'm influencing something or intervening into a system, whether it's a team or a bigger or wider group in an organization or an individual. So it's kind of that reflective practice again. Like, so what is it that I'm telling about it is influencing the way I'm intervening it.
And how do you use the model with the leaders that you work with and the teams that you work with in your organization now?
It's probably, I don't like to be very theory led.
Yeah.
So I don't tend to go like, this is a CMM theory and this is how you use it. So it might be wrapped into subtle ways of, how do you enhance your practice? When you go into a conversation, how does it look like? What is your intention? So it is more of a reflective questions to help leaders to reflect kind of what is it that they bring? What's the idea they have about leadership and how they're using it in their conversations, how that idea is driving some of the work that they're doing and how conscious they are.
Yeah, because we often talk about leadership as if it's a thing, a kind of singular, easily defined thing, but pretty much everybody you talk to has got their own version of it and their own interpretation. So yeah, just asking that question, I guess, can be really powerful.
And I think there is still kind of, I think still a lot of the work that we do if I think about leadership development, is very much still a leader development focus. So, and then I feel like it's kind of, as much as you can bring that system in and that thinking of how you influence and you work in the wider relationships, the better. But I'm still keen to find different ways how you actually work with the relational dynamics and bring the whole and work with that material, because that's, I find leadership development is very much still very traditional.
You're sort of saying it's applying the power of questions to challenge people's thinking or to think about things in a slightly different way. So would you say one of sort of the primary tools of someone who's practicing things like CMM is questioning, would you say?
I think if I go back to sort of the foundations of systemic thinking and all of that, I think there's a sort of principles of leading with curiosity and inquiry and questions is very much sort of important parts of being a great OD consultant or OD practitioner, even internally. So yeah, trying to live by it as much as possible, but also kind of include that in the interventions and programs that I'm running.
So one question we like to ask all our podcast guests is, how did you end up in this role? What was your journey into organisation development? Because nobody comes out of school and says that's what I want to do.
Yeah, I did actually.
Did you?
Did you? Oh, you're the first guest.
You're the first guest
we
so
like
far.
this.
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and it's like there's probably part of me that actually went knowing that I want to do something in this space quite early on. So, and I tell everyone who I meet, and it's like I'm a proper geek, and there was this weird curiosity and puzzlement about humans quite early on. So I was about 10 years old when I went to a charity shop and bought like some very old psychology books to do personality assessments and on myself, apply to myself. But I think there was some curiosities quite early on in my life. And I think probably a couple of things that I was always sort of curious. So the first one's kind of understanding myself a bit more, because I didn't think I was the most competent of communicators. I've always felt there's some clunkiness in the way I was. And then the other bit was kind of understanding or perceiving and observing this kind of weird games happening around me when a group of girls all of a sudden was like, actually, we decide to be your friend today, but not tomorrow. And it was just kind of, what's going on? Why these things happen? So I think that kind of led me into really trying to understand the psychological side of things quite early on. And then when it wasn't my career path, but I always thought I would be an artist and become an art teacher or something in that field. But I had psychology in the back pocket all the time, continuously. And when it came to time to decide a university and what studies I will go and do, there was this wonderful new field called interpersonal communication in my hometown in Jyväskylä, Finland. And that was somehow described a mixture of understanding human interaction and how people communicate with one another and so forth. And I was like, this is great. I'm going for it. So quite early on, I think I went through the whole journey, was very interested in leadership, interpersonal communication as such, did the full kind of study route, did my master's around trust in leadership and all of that. So I've been kind of in that space. And then when it came to time to leave the uni and sort of see like what next, I already knew I want to go to a consulting company and do some stuff around this. So, and then that's when I went and started. I had a comms role to start with, so a very traditional comms role, but at least I had my leg in there through the door and I could kind of slowly move into a consulting role, which was kind of interesting. I was 25, straight from uni, trying to be a seriously taken consultant in organizational development, which wasn't the most easiest of journeys, I would say.
And then you've done a doctorate as well, so you've got your PhD.
Yeah.
How did that come about? And tell us a bit more about it.
Yeah, so probably continuing from that story, as a young sort of consultant, young female consultant, I find there were a lot of expectations when you go and meet with clients. And all of a sudden, I was in a place that, well, I'm working with others that have 20 plus years more experience than I have, which is great because I was learning a lot. It was a big learning curve. But then to sell myself to potential client is like, I can't just make up of 20 years of experience. So how do I do that? How do I position myself that feels credible? And that's sort of where the only thing I can think of is, one was using my artistic skills. So I did some in kind of work in that route in terms of graphic facilitation and so forth. And the second was like, I'll go and get a more qualified degree in this space. So that at the end of the day, I can maybe get some credibility in that sense.
And it's really interesting because one of the things about OD, one of the criticisms leveled as it is elitist, that there are sort of perceived barriers to entry, or that many of the people sort of are positioned as accomplished, often are of an age. And so how was that for you, being that sort of 25-year-old consultant with all of the ability, and you've probably done just as much study, if not more, than a lot of your peers because you started so young? What was it, and how did you find that sort of actually out in the consulting field?
It was tough. It wasn't the easiest because I felt I was questioned quite a lot. But at the same time, I got really strong support from all of my colleagues. So I'm forever grateful for the colleagues and the kind of more experienced consultants I ever worked with, for giving me so much trust, responsibility, and just kind of really appreciating and valuing what I was bringing. So, and I think one of the key thing was that we always worked in pairs. That is something that I would just say, like, especially as a younger member, or younger person entering this field, it's always valuable to work in partnership with someone, so you can start to sort of take ownership of some of the aspects of, if it's a program or facilitating change conversation, so that at least you get the exposure.
And it's so important, isn't it? When you're in the room, there is so much going on. Like, obviously,
Yeah,
Danny and I co-facilitate pretty much everything, don't we?
We do.
And it just helps so much, doesn't it? Because
yeah,
you're managing process and content at the same time, aren't you? And
yeah,
if you are trying to create transformational changes, there sometimes can be some extraordinary things going on in the
yeah.
room that you have to sort of notice, facilitate, manage, whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it depends kind of what role you are, but sometimes taking a bit of the back seat, just observing and kind of seeing what happens in the room was very useful, because then you are in that reflective space, not really taking a stage or anything to then lead the process, but you had that sort of space to just observe and see, going, oh, how they respond to that, and what's happening there, and what's that group having a conversation about over that corner over there. So you kind of observe and learn in that way very well. And I think the other bit that I was a big learning is that being very comfortable and becoming comfortable with just going with the flow and going with the dynamics and not really knowing what's going to happen next, or that you don't need to have all of the answers. You just, if you just ask the question, that's good enough. So I think that was one of the early learnings for me. So when I would go and like, what's the plan, what's happening, we do 15 minutes of this and then 20 minutes of that, and what are we doing? And then lots of my colleagues would just like rip off the paper, like, I don't have a plan, I have a bit of a mind map here, but let's just go. And they would be working on their flip charts and sometimes just change the course of action. I was just like, I have no clue what's going on now and what's going next, and there is no plan. and and just becoming quite comfortable with that early on was very helpful for me, and a big learning, I would say.
And one thing we like to ask everybody is, just we're trying to demystify OD a bit. So what's a typical week look like for you?
Oh gosh, let's see. It probably depends the work that is a priority at that moment. But for me, there are elements of, thinking about the team and sort of like, actually, what is it that we need to prioritize this week? So there's kind of element of more management of the resources that you have at hand and what's coming in the week and what would be important to do and accomplish this week. So I think that's more of your planning and management of that. But then it would be liaising with other stakeholders, colleagues, HR team, kind of what's coming up. Do they need any assistance with anything? Talent reviews coming, or, things like that. It would involve looking at some of the data points. And one of the things I've just recent years learned, that data is becoming more and more important. So just kind of looking at kind of what do we know about this team or this situation, and if there's a way that we can utilize that better. So those would be some of things: planning, creating plans for a program, communication, drafting some, how do we want to launch it, who needs to be involved, how do we want to go, and how do we want to invite people, what are the right methods and mediums to do that. So liaising then with our internal comms teams and making sure that everything is kind of aligned. If there are any sort of further data like surveys that we've conducted, is kind of pulling that together, making sure that whatever we present is done in a that there's some sort of outcomes of it. So it really varies on different. Oh, looking at our learning and development calendar, what's coming up, how we've communicated that, do we have a clear portfolio?
So what kind of data would you be sort of looking on? What might be some of the indicators that tell you about the health of a team, or like what might be some of those early warning signs that you'd be watching for?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I mean, I probably have a bit of a weird relationship with data, um, because I think that there's that kind of relational sort of softer side of it that often gets missed. But if we kind of look at more of a hardcore numeric quantitative data, I think you would be looking at kind of how do you want to, what's the fitness of the organization? So are there like areas where there are lots of levers? How is performance related to that? So you would be looking at sort of performance ratings or any evaluations that you can find in the system, any talent data, succession plans. Are there certain gaps in different areas. Hiring, you might do some of the hiring aspect of like how many roles and vacancies we have. Are they going to be filled soon or not? Does that pose any risks? And things like that. And then you have all of the engagement side of things. So what's the feedback we're getting from the business? Are there certain pockets or themes that we can look? Are they in pockets in different teams, or are there some sort of consistent themes across the business, and how all of that kind of marries up together if it does?
So we had a bit of a pre-meet about this because and one of the things that you talked about is that's really important in organizations, and as you're sort of describing your week, is the power of moments. So things just kind of happen, and there's an opportunity that lays in that moment where you could continue on your current path, keeping to recurring patterns, or there might be new ways. What's some of your thinking around that at the moment? Why does that sort of resonate so strongly with you?
I think, and it probably comes from a bit from the CMM background as well, that when we are in a conversation, or whether it's a meeting or yeah, just in a conversation in general, dialogue with someone, they can be critical moments in terms of sort of describing how we go on after that. And I think there's the idea that, some moments can be more critical. So when there's an important decision to be made, is kind of how we decide on that, and then what happens afterwards, because it's almost like when it's done, it's done. There's an afterlife, and then you manage the consequences of whatever kind of whatever you ended up in your conversation. So I think that is important just to keep in mind, and especially if there are those critical stakeholders or things when you feel like actually there's something there, or feel that there's something important going on here, it's useful to stop there and pause and sort of like, what is it that we're actually creating here, and where we are going with it, and what's the impact of that? So I guess the question is always that, what is it that we're creating with this decision? So if we do this, what's the purpose of it? What is it that we're creating as a result of that? And does it matter if we want to create, more inclusive culture? Is this conversation helping or working towards that? And in what way? So I guess it kind of trying to marry like the big and the small moments in a sense.
So what happens in the micro actually is reflective of what's happening in the macro, and vice versa as well.
Yes, yes. And I think they're always connected. And that's why I think like the change is, it's not just a work with individuals or just with teams or just as an organization. You kind of cut through all of the layers and have to work on multiple layers at the same time. So that's why sometimes the smallest conversations can make a big impact somewhere, somehow.
Which reminds me a little bit of your PhD. So you did a really interesting study, and some of the things that stood out for me is that you worked with like a senior team over a protracted period of time. You did such things as like have a 360 camera in the middle of the leadership room, and you could actually sort of video what people's responses were and what was happening in the moment. Can you just tell us a little bit more about this? Because I'm sure people will find that absolutely fascinating, and that sort of talks to the power of moments, doesn't it? Because you
Yeah,
were actually coaching people live in the moment. You would
yeah.
pause and go, right, we're doing a thing right now.
So it started, so kind of my PhD, kind of the premise of that was like, how do you facilitate competent communication? Because we know those senior teams in an organization. So this was a team with a CEO and sort of his closest sort of your typical kind of HR director, and kind of the roles that you would normally see in a team like that. So it was really kind of trying to understand and unpack the kind of the patterns, the relationships, the way they talk to one another, because ultimately they're there together making decisions, and the way they talk to one another will have an impact on the quality of those decisions. I think that's the sort of the thinking behind it. But the way it was done, and I think my premise is, rather than take them off site somewhere and train for them for competent communication for 2 days, it was done in their actual meetings. So then it felt a bit more real, that they're actually doing the doing. They're talking about the stuff that they would normally talk about, like, their business and so forth. And they would relate to one another like they would normally do in those meetings. So I felt hugely privileged to be part of that. And so for months period, I sat every month, 2 days. They had a big senior leadership team meeting, and I sat there with them those 2 days. I had a 360 camera rolling out, taking record for 2 full days, and then I would go and analyze it. But in the meetings and in the kind of during the meetings, I would have certain slots where I would sort of go like, actually, what happened here? Can you kind of explain, or did you notice that, and so forth. So it was kind of bringing the whole notion of working in the moment and the actual conversations and the impact of that into the conversation as we were working.
Because at senior leadership level, when you're round the table, there is so much going on, isn't there?
So much going on.
And it's not even just the people round the table, are there? Because behind them, sort of invisibly, are all their teams going, do not make a decision on this, or do not commit to this.
Yeah.
So it's a real complex interplay and language games and everything going
Yeah.
on as well, isn't it? But
Yeah.
on the surface, it looks perfectly logical. So
Yeah.
that must be, like you said, it must be an incredibly incredible feeling to actually be in there and watching it and be able to help people pause. What were some of the breakthroughs or sort of insights that you managed to sort of tease out?
Well, I did sometimes it was the pattern as well. So kind of who, and it sounds very structural, but who starts first and then how it cascades through. And they had a pattern that, this CEO often started the meeting with a half an hour monologue about how bad things are and how bad the team is. It's just changing that pattern. Like, can you just kind of ask a question how everyone is? And maybe everyone has a turn and they will equally share what's going on for them, and maybe some positive notion about what they appreciate or what's gone well in the last month. And even just more change like that just meant that later in the meeting you could see much more participation from the others, whereas it was very much sort of presentation mode, at least to begin with. So there were some of those kind of changes, and then it started to happen naturally, and people started to sort of appreciate and kind of give good feedback in the moments. Whereas I think in the beginning you had to tease it out a little bit.
Part of the human condition to fall into patterns, even if
Yeah,
the pattern is deeply, no one wants to start a meeting here a half an hour of how bad we're doing, but it's our pattern and that's what we do.
that's yeah, and we have it every day in and out, and I think I find patterns very fascinating, because we can get stuck in them quite easily, and sometimes we're stuck in them and we know we're stuck in them and still we can't change, because it's that kind of compelling, we're pulled into them, and I think at some point our brains are so, the pathway has been so well walked that it's hard to get away from it. So yeah, I find them really fascinating. What are the little things that you can start to do just to change it a little bit?
I was going to say, what advice would you give to somebody who's conscious they're in a pattern in their workplace? Where would you suggest they start if they feel like they're stuck?
Yeah, well, I would always probably go back to sort of what's your story about the pattern? What are you telling yourself about the situation? Is there something that you can change? So, the great saying is like, be the change you want to see in the world. Kind of like, is there something that you can start to do differently and you would respond differently? So there's always that choice and doing something that is a bit different, even if it feels a bit unnatural or clunky at first.
Because often people's episodes start so much earlier, don't they? So
Yeah,
if two people have had a conflict and it
yeah,
wasn't resolved to one person's satisfaction,
yeah,
every
yeah,
single thing that other person does from then on either feeds into that narrative that they've got about them,
yeah,
and it
yeah,
just compounds, doesn't it? So
yeah,
sometimes CMM can be quite useful to storyboard and just to say, so where did this all begin, and
yeah,
unpack it. That could be quite useful, can't it?
yeah. Absolutely. And sometimes it is acknowledging that our response is a third response, not the second. So often you would might say, well, I had to say this because you did that. But what they did was already a response to something else. So it's kind of understanding that there's a continuum, there's a history and pre-context to situation. So you're not just responding to something, you are responding to something that you've been creating and which was already a response to something that was there before. So I guess it's kind of seeing beyond the immediate behavior and kind of almost trying to understand where did it come from and what happened before that made that thing happen now. So it's just kind of enriches our story of the situation and gives a bit more understanding of why someone behaves in a certain way, or how they might respond to a situation in a certain way.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because we've had times where we've done this with teams, and if you look at it, like sometimes when people start to see how much they're because people like to simplify and say, well, it's their
Yeah,
fault, all their
yeah,
fault, and don't
yeah,
dilute my version of this because it's easier to hold it this way. But when you do play it back, sometimes it can then release emotions of sometimes guilt, sometimes a little
yeah,
bit of shame and all that kind of stuff as well. So it's a skill of being able to bring that out, hold it, manage it, and then
yeah,
help them move on, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. I think there's that kind of, you kind of framed it, sort of holding the space for people to be able to explore. And I would say it is exploring. It's not, judgmental in a way, or assuming like, well, you did that because of X, Y, and Z. Is exploring together. And I think that's also the kind of the nice thing about having a proper dialogue as well, because it is paying attention to also what happens in the moment, and both having the responsibility oneself, but also understanding why people might be responding the way they are. And it's just a different framing in for a conversation.
Yeah. What do you enjoy most about your role and the field you work in? What
Oh
really lights
gosh.
you up?
I like creativity. I like being in a space when you have all the options and opportunities in front of you, and then you start designing and shaping something that can make a big difference. So I like being in that space. So that's probably kind of in the different roles when I feel that it's a bit of a blank canvas that I can work with. That's enjoyable for me. I've previously, in some previous roles, had to run certain like very set programs, and I get bored very quickly, because it's kind of you're repeating, whereas I'm a bit more like, let's change that a little bit, or so I like working with people in the moment, where's that flexibility and kind of you can almost go with where the energy is, and you have that freedom to do that, rather than like, oh no, we need to run this section because we said it's in the program and we have a 1 hour slot of that and we have to do it. So let's forget all of the conversation important things that you've just said because we have a program to follow. So I'm probably not as good with that.
I guess that's the challenge of where L&D meets OD, though, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's a tension to be managed, I guess, isn't it?
yeah.
What are your sort of, I'm not going to say there's an answer because there is no answer, but like, what are your reflections on that?
um I think there's because having been in L&D roles as well previously, and then running courses and trainings and sort of bite-sized sessions. So there's always a bit of a plan and a structure. Like, if someone would learn something about this, what would that be? And what are the kind of essentials that we would include in this? But then I think there's a flexibility of just rip the plan and focus what's kind of emerges in the moment and what seems to be an important conversation or a need, or something that happens in real life, and it would be much more valuable to spend time on that. So I guess it's kind of that balancing act, like what's the point of, I guess that it goes back to the question, like what's the purpose I'm serving. So
Yeah,
if it's sort of like, if the purpose of the L&D and of course I'm increasing their capability or making them grow or develop in certain areas, then you can do that in various different ways. If the purpose is like, I have this content which I need to go through, that's a very different take, which can then direct the kind of the session in different ways.
Yeah, it's a judgment call, isn't it? You kind of almost is the trade-off of talking about this thing now for more time
Mm, yeah.
more important than not talking about something else a bit later on. So yeah, but yeah, in the moment. And what do you find most challenging? So we talked about what you love. What are the most challenging bits of the work you do?
The most challenging oh gosh, there's probably, I think there's always that kind of the internal dynamics and navigating through the various different things. And sometimes I like action. So sometimes spending the time doing your kind of stakeholder engagement and involvement is kind of balancing that frustration sometimes, like, oh, why can't we just get on with this and just do it? so but that's my kind of personal drive, and then trying to sort of like, actually, we need to have those conversations, we need to kind of make sure everyone is aligned, and we can then launch it more successfully. But that's probably one of the things. And then sometimes looking very long term in terms of, on a journey that we might be in some planes 2 years time, and having that in mind when you plan something. And I think I have a personal urge always things could have happen a bit earlier, a bit quicker.
And you work extensively globally, particularly in Belron as well. How's that kind of sort of shaped your work? Because sometimes what we see in organizations is yes, it is a global organization, but it has a head office, and it often
Yeah.
could become quite asymmetrical if in terms of like it all flows from there. And I guess so how do you have to flex your role to make sure that it is an inclusive environment for different parts of the organization?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, especially I've gone through both when from a very decentralized module to a centralized, and going through that shift as well. So you have like, I think the pain points with a very decentralized is like, you think like you're doing all this wonderful work, but no one is taking it, or it happens in isolation, or someone is running a great program in Germany or somewhere else, but no one else is implementing it. So I think that's the challenge with when you have lots of freedom and everyone can kind of choose what they want, really. Um, so I think then it's like, what other forums and practices where you can come to share learning and then see kind of what works in which environment. With the more centralized, I found it becomes more of, we design the approach, the toolkit, the frames, and which is probably your typical sort of center of excellence type of, you have your team kind of designing all of the things, templates, packets, and so forth, and then handing over, and off you go and you implement it. And that sometimes can be quite difficult because, and I find it quite difficult because then I'm not necessarily part of the implementation journey, and see kind of how is actually landing, and making sure the feedback loop then comes back. So I think those are some of the challenging dynamics.
And one we always like to ask is, what's the biggest lesson you think you've learned if you look back over your career so far? What's the biggest lesson or two that you've learned?
I would probably go back to that early career that I was talking about, sort of being comfortable with the not knowing. And I think I'm very grateful that I had that very early on, and before I got too stuck in my ways. So I think that has definitely served or been a big benefit for me throughout my career. And I think the other bit and a big learning is when I've moved from external to internal. And that transition and how it looks like has been quite interesting, and sort of like looking at the nuances and the differences of what it is and what it means. And I think one of the first, and it might sound a bit silly, but as an external, it was always like when booking dates with clients. And it was always like, it's very simple, like just book some dates in the diary and, off we go. And then trying to do that from an internal perspective is like, oh my, it takes a lot of time and effort to even get a date in a diary. And it's just like, it's kind of, it sounds very silly, but it's those kind of things that I didn't probably appreciate being external, but then learn to appreciate being internal, as well as kind of seeing more of how things then land and continue throughout the organization. And so it's been kind of interesting too, and appreciating kind of the work to different sides, I would say.
It's a really interesting thing you're saying there, isn't it? Because Danny and I were talking about this the other day. There was a really good podcast by The Ready, and they talk about traditional consultancies working with organizations, and that when you're a consultant going into an organization, you create this new kind of power dynamic. So you have access, you get meetings, and those are the massive payoffs. As an insider, you get access to lots of other conversations that you don't get as an external person. As an external consultant, you're creating a temporary structure to do your work, and therefore when the challenge is that you leave, it's making sure that it's not reliant on you being able to work in that way, and that the organization can continue to function in this effective way. Do you feel that you kind of have one foot in each world now, and that's affording you a new luxury?
Yes, I think probably. I mean, there are always challenges being internal. I found sometimes that external, especially after doing my PhD, it was like, rock up and you're convincing, and whatever you say is almost taken like, oh yeah, yeah, that's great. Whereas I get a lot more questioning, I feel, as an internal, like, okay, what, and I think there's a credibility there. So I find that dynamic interesting, that there's still people, and sometimes not in my current and but also previous, like when you get external speakers in, it seems much more valuable. And more like, oh, we got this one. And it's like sometimes, well, I could have talked the same thing, but it doesn't land as well, which is interesting.
Well, you have to sort of say you've loosened them up, so when they hear it from the external person, they're like, "Oh, that's a great idea." You've done the
Yeah,
work though, haven't you?
yeah, exactly.
How do you invest in your own learning and development now? What does that look like for you?
I mentioned I'm a proper geek. So I always have books on the go. So some have come from this podcast recommendations. So I've always a book to go. I've loads in my own library, so I tend to go back to some of the classics, like in the CMM. So I think kind of revisiting some of the books that I've read many years ago is always valuable as well. So that's probably my main thing. I try to listen to, I think it's probably consuming content and ideas and thoughts at the moment, which is kind of key part, and I can sort of manage that on a day-to-day basis. The one thing I am missing, or what would be more important, I want to invest more time is being in networks and sort of being going back to my origins, being part of the OD sort of networks, meeting with people, because there's always valuable things in kind of sharing practice, but also kind of stimulating intellectually, kind of, yeah, what are you doing in that world, and how are you doing it? So I think that there's valuable bits in there. So those probably are two things that I'm thinking at the moment.
And then the final question we finish every conversation with is, because obviously our people that are aspiring OD practitioners, we want to inspire the next generation coming through, but they come from all sorts of different places, and I think that's probably the wonderful richness of OD. What advice would you give to someone who's just starting their career or just considering their first steps into organization development?
Oh gosh, yeah, there's so many different routes. I would start with a good old self-reflection, and I think, and kind of the idea of the use of self, and that you as an instrument, what it is. What is that instrument? What is it that you bring and, want to do, and, where you want to make a difference? What's your take on things? Those are kind of the important things I would, and what's kind of what ticks you? What are the things that you get out of it as well? And being kind of clear, kind of what is the purpose you're serving when you go into a client system, or whether you are going internally, sort of what are some of the things that you would want to get out of it, and clarifying that for yourself. I think that's where I would start. The tools and techniques will come. Being kind of working with yourself first, I think, is always important in leadership.
It's a step that it's easy to miss, but it's fundamental, isn't it?
Yes, yes, and it's a never ending. I mean, like, I'm probably still, you know, doing good old reflection. It's always there, and it's hard work, but it's so worth it, because I think the clearer you are yourself about why you're doing what you're doing, and what is this thing that you are doing, it's just easy. And I find it always saying, there's tools and techniques, but the way you use them depends on who you are and what you think, what's your idea, what's your belief, and so forth.
Amazing. Well, I want to just say a huge thank you, Eerika, from Danny and I. We've been looking forward to this conversation. It's been really, really enjoyable, really insightful, and it's been really nice because it kind of reconnected me back with CMM. Just the richness of it. Well, I'm taking away loads of things, and I'm sure you are, Danny, as well. If I had to sort of condense it into three, I guess it's kind of just going back to what you're saying about that comfortable with not knowing. It's like, particularly when you're getting started, or feeling like you're in the people put you in the role of expert, it's that you feel like you should know, but you just don't know, and it's better to
no clue. Something that I've like no idea.
but it's reassuring.
You can't know either, can you? You know.
No.
Yeah.
No, and I think there's that kind of like and going back to the communication, that whatever we do can be limiting, or kind of you create affordances and you create constraints at the same time. So I think there's that kind of dynamic and responsibility of like, what is it I'm creating with my, if I ask a question, I know it will take it to a different direction. And that's the responsibility of when you're doing an inquiry, that you do a mindful question, but also knowing that by doing that, I am closing some options, but opening some options.
Yeah, and that's a mindset, isn't it, to carry with you. The other thing, second thing, was the power of moments. Just that these are wonderful bifurcation points where, sometimes it can take enormous amount of courage or bravery to actually step in and challenge that status quo and ask what is going on here, or, just make people aware that they are making choices, or and that kind of leads to the third one, which is just being really mindful of the patterns that we're making. And patterns are everywhere, and that humans love patterns. And so just really just taking a step back and being reflexive and thinking, so which of the patterns that I'm participating in, which ones are healthy and which ones are pathologizing as well. So that's been fascinating for me. How about you, Danny?
Yeah, I think the things I'd add to that would be the point you made about being really clear on the frame of reference you're going into a system with. So you do that before you go into the system, so you're clear on that, and the importance of reflexive practice. I was going to pick up the point you already made about the importance of asking that question: what are we creating with this decision, or this decision not to do anything? Really understanding that. And then the point of real dialogue is about holding space and creating space for exploration. So they were the three things I'd summarize.
And you can hold a space whether you're 55 or 25. I think that's the big thing, isn't it? You're holding the space, aren't you?
Yes. And there's a benefit of that as well, kind of, because it's also, you're bringing something that is different as well. So
brilliant. Well, I know that everyone who's going to watch is going to be really interested. And I guess if people want to follow your work, Eerika, or if they have a question, can they reach out to you?
Of course, I'm always happy to have a conversation.
Brilliant. And you're quite active is LinkedIn a good place to reach out to?
LinkedIn is probably the best way to connect. Yeah, I'm quite active there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for being so generous with your time. We know you're extremely busy, so thank you for giving up your Friday afternoon to talk with Danny and I. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
And you, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Eerika.